What if I told you the bloodiest war in American history didn't actually start with some noble moral crusade, but with a terrifyingly fragile math equation? Seriously, forget everything you think you know about the predictable march of history. Today, we're going to look at a young nation that quite literally tore itself into pieces. And this didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of mounting, inescapable pressure. In this explainer, we are going straight inside the powder keg of the 19th century.
But before continuing, we upload new history videos every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Okay, let's dive right into this. The year is 1819. On paper, the United States looked like this picture of perfect harmony, but behind the scenes, it was entirely held together by a deadly math problem, keeping 11 equal to 11. That's 11 free states and 11 slave states. Equal representation, equal influence. It was basically a perfectly balanced seesaw. But here's the thing. You absolutely cannot keep a seesaw balanced when you're violently throwing massive new weights onto either side of it. Section 1. The deadly math problem. You see, Manifest Destiny wasn't just this majestic, romantic exploration of the West. It was an aggressive real estate binge that actively threatened to tip that deadly scale. And man, things spiraled out of control fast. First, you have the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which literally draws a line in the dirt. But then America grabs massive new territories from Mexico, so we get the Compromise of 1850, which is really just another political band-aid. By 1855, those band-aids completely fall off. Settlers just start flooding into Kansas to illegally sway the vote on slavery, sparking this miniature 4-year war called Bleeding Kansas. Legal loopholes devolved into actual guerrilla warfare. Blood was already spilling. The real reason they couldn't just agree was that these were two entirely incompatible economic machines. The North had industrialized, right? They relied on wage labor and factories. They didn't need slavery to survive economically, which is exactly what allowed a moral abolitionist movement to really take root. But the South? They hadn't industrialized at all. Their entire economy, their personal finances, their whole way of life was utterly dependent on the brutal reality of plantation slave labor. Peaceful reconciliation was literally an economic impossibility. Section 2, the pressure cooker explodes. So what was the catalyst? It was the 1860 election of a Northern Republican named Abraham Lincoln, which essentially prompted 11 Southern states to just pack up and abandon the Union entirely. The sheer underdog audacity of the Confederacy is kind of staggering when you look at the raw numbers. The Union had 22 million people. The South had roughly 9 million. The North had double the railroad miles for moving troops and supplies. And get this, the North produced 90% of all goods in the country. 90%! The South was basically declaring war on a massive industrial Goliath. So the crucial point here is how the South justified this insane gamble. When South Carolina left, they issued a document that explicitly stated, a geographical line has been drawn across the Union. It's a chilling, literal description. They were taking a scalpel directly to the map of the country. The tension finally snaps at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861. Picture Fort Sumter. It's this tiny, undersupplied Union stronghold sitting right out in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. 6,000 Southerners surround it. A single 10-inch mortar lights up the early morning sky, signaling the start of a relentless, hours-long bombardment. And just like that, the Civil War had officially begun. Now, early in the war, things were incredibly messy. Lincoln's primary goal was really just keeping the Union together, not immediately abolishing slavery. So when enslaved people escaped two Union lines, they weren't instantly welcomed as free citizens. No, the Union enacted the Confiscation Act, which actually classified escaped slaves as contraband. They were essentially treating human beings as seized enemy property, using them as laborers on military infrastructure. It was a cold, calculated military tactic. We were very far from a moral crusade at this stage. Section 3. The bloodiest battles. Both sides honestly thought they could win this whole thing in a few months. Instead, they marched straight into a complete nightmare. This number is an absolute punch to the gut. 13,000. That is the number of Union casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, at the Battle of Shiloh alone, with the Confederates losing over 10,000 of their own. Men who had scarcely ever even seen a battle were thrown directly into a bloodbath. Up to that day, it was the deadliest battle in U.S. history. And the terrifying part? It was only the beginning. What followed was just a brutal, chaotic back and forth across the continent, Hundreds of thousands of men were fed into this literal meat grinder. You had Union disasters at Bull Run, the completely bloody single-day horror of Antietam, massive Confederate tactical wins at Chancellorsville, and of course the unfathomable carnage of Gettysburg, where over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in just 3 days. But hey, even in victory, the South suffered crippling blows. After an incredibly bold flanking maneuver at Chancellorsville, their brilliant tactician Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot in the dark by his own men. He died days later. Confederate General Robert E. Lee's response really highlights the catastrophic emotional and tactical loss here. He simply said, "I have lost my right arm." Section 4. A shift in strategy. By this point, the Northern public was completely exhausted, and the Union desperately needed a new plan to break this brutal, bloody stalemate. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. But here is the shocking truth about that. It didn't actually free all the slaves. It only applied to slaves in the rebel states. Any border states that had stayed loyal to the Union? Totally exempt. And obviously, the seceding states weren't just going to hand over the enslaved people they were actively fighting a war to keep, right? This meant the proclamation required sheer, literal military force to actually enforce. But what the proclamation did do was completely shift the momentum of the entire war, because it officially allowed Black men to join the Union military. Roughly 200,000 Black soldiers enlisted. Think about that. They were risking absolutely everything, knowing full well they faced execution or immediate enslavement if they were captured, just to fight for the freedom of their countrymen. Incredible. Meanwhile, Union General Ulysses S. Grant realized he needed to break the South geographically by taking the Mississippi River. To do that, he had to conquer the supposedly impregnable city of Vicksburg. Grant's strategy here was just pure, stubborn innovation. His men literally drained bayous. They built new roads right through swamps, marched around the city, surrounded it with 15 miles of trenches, and just bombarded it for 47 days straight. They choked Vicksburg until it surrendered on July 4th. The Union had officially sliced the Confederacy in half. Section 5. Scorched Earth. The Union finally realized that simply beating the Confederate Army on the battlefield wasn't going to be enough to end this. Enter General William T. Sherman and his infamous March to the Sea. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman took 62,000 men on an absolute rampage across Georgia to Savannah. He intentionally targeted infrastructure. They burned farms, they ripped up railroads, and they actively destroyed the breadbasket of the Confederacy. It was a terrifying, relentless campaign of total devastation. And the crazy thing is, Sherman was completely unapologetic about this scorched earth tactic. Reflecting on the destruction of cities like Columbia, he later said, "I never shed any tears over the event because I believe that it hastened what we all fought for, the end of the war." And honestly, that is the terrifying logic of total warfare. Break the infrastructure, break the spirit, end the war. Section 6. The staggering final toll. The resistance finally collapses, but the price of restoring this union was almost unfathomable. $6.7 billion. That was the staggering financial cost of the war at the time, which completely, utterly devastated the Southern economy. But honestly, the money absolutely pales in comparison to the blood. The human cost of this conflict is just devastating to look at. 365,000 Union soldiers dead, 290,000 Confederate soldiers dead, 80,000 enslaved people lost, 50,000 civilians killed. Entire generations of Americans were literally wiped out in a span of just 4 years. But from that staggering, unimaginable carnage came a permanent change. Before the war, people referred to the country in the plural. They would say, "The United States are." After the war, the grammar itself shifted. It became "the United States is," a plural unit forged by fire and blood into a singular, unified nation. So the big takeaway here really leaves us with a question. If the cost of true unity is this incredibly high, how do we ensure a pressure cooker like this never ever explodes again?